August 30th, 1945. The Pacific stretched out grey and lifeless, flattened by relentless wind. The water seemed exhausted, as if even the ocean had grown weary of war. And at last, the war had ended. On the deck of a United States Navy transport ship, Japanese women stood huddled together in thin clothing, their bodies swaying with the movement of the sea. Their eyes were wide, alert, uncertain. Some had been nurses captured on Pacific islands. Others were clerks or civilians swept into captivity by the sudden collapse of the Japanese Empire. Their faces were pale, framed by dark hair tied without care, and their expressions carried the exhaustion of a nation that had been broken. They had grown up surrounded by propaganda posters that depicted Americans as beasts, monsters with claws and fangs, creatures without mercy. Yet now they were guarded by young men in pressed khaki uniforms, speaking unfamiliar accents. These men did not spit at them. They did not strike them. Instead, they offered cigarettes or water, gestures meant for strangers, not enemies. The women struggled to reconcile what they saw with what they had been taught. The ship creaked as it cut through the ocean toward the American coast, carrying surrender across thousands of miles of water. At first, the women remained silent, standing close together, their breath visible in the cool air. Some clutched what little they still possessed, worn satchels, faded photographs, a folded kimono hidden beneath military-issued blankets. Each woman carried not only belongings, but a memory of survival. One, a 28-year-old nurse, had served in a field hospital on Saipan. She had watched friends leap from cliffs rather than surrender to Americans they believed were monsters. Another, barely 21, had worked as a typist in a garrison office until U.S. troops surrounded the island. A third, older than the rest, had been caring for children in a missionary compound when surrender turned them all into prisoners. Their journeys differed, but the fear was the same. What awaited them in the enemy's land? The Americans aboard the ship were boys many no older than the women themselves, sons of Iowa farmers, steel workers from Pennsylvania, baseball players from Texas. War had transformed them into sailors and guards. They walked the deck with casual authority, rifles slung loosely, smiles flickering when they noticed the women staring. One soldier, amused by the tension, extended a Lucky Strike cigarette, tapping the pack before offering it. The women recoiled at first, unsure whether it was a trick. When one finally accepted, her hands shaking, the soldier simply nodded and lit it for her. It was a small gesture, but it cracked the wall of fear built through years of indoctrination. These were not monsters. They were simply men. The voyage was long. Time blurred aboard the ship. Meals arrived regularly, bread, soup, sometimes meat. The women were stunned by the abundance, though some could not eat, their stomachs knotted by nerves. Nights were cold. The bunks were hard. Whispers filled the darkness as they tried to imagine where they were headed. California, maybe Texas. Names that sounded vast and unreal. None of them had seen America. They had heard of it only as a land of arrogance, skyscrapers, and endless machines. To imagine themselves there felt as impossible as imagining peace after years of air raids and rationing. Yet the most unsettling realization did not come from fear of the future. It came from watching the Americans. Compared to the men they had known in Japan, thin from rice shortages, hollowed by years of war, the Americans seemed impossibly tall, broad-shouldered, full of energy. Their uniforms fit easily. Their boots shined. Their laughter rose above the wind. They had been taught Americans were decadent and weak. But these men looked strong, healthy, alive. The contradiction gnawed at them. One evening, as the sun burned red along the horizon, the nurse from Saipan stood at the railing, staring at the glowing line where sea met sky. A young American sailor leaned nearby, smoking. For a long time, neither spoke. Two figures from opposite worlds, sharing silence. Finally, the sailor spoke, his voice gentle. "You'll be safe there." She did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. Not menace, not hatred, something close to kindness. She turned away quickly, unsettled by how human it sounded. Inside the ship, conversations grew bolder. One young woman whispered that the guards looked like actors from American films she had seen before the war. Another said their smiles frightened her too open, too free. A third admitted that standing near such tall men made her feel invisible, like a child. They laughed nervously, but unease remained. If everything they had been taught was false, then what else was a lie? Days passed. Slowly, fear softened into wary observation. The women noticed details: the way Americans teased one another, the way one whistled while polishing his boots, the way another prayed quietly at night. They had prepared for cruelty. Instead, they encountered normal life, and that realization was painful. On the morning of August 30th, land finally appeared. A faint line on the horizon, then shape, then the unmistakable outline of America. The women pressed to the rails, hearts racing. For some, fear surged again. For others, curiosity awakened. The guards stood nearby, gazing toward home as if returning from a long shift rather than ending a world war. The contrast was unbearable. They were entering a land they had been taught to hate, a land that would now decide their fate. Yet beside them stood men whose existence contradicted every warning and caricature they had believed. As the ship neared the harbor, gulls circled overhead. The air smelled of land. One woman whispered to the nurse beside her, "If they are not monsters, then what are they?" The nurse had no answer. She stared at the American docks, rising from the mist, at rows of soldiers waiting, taller, broader, cleaner than she had imagined. Her pulse quickened. The journey across the ocean was ending, but the greater journey had only just begun. The harbor rose from the mist like both promise and threat. Wooden piers stretched out into the water, dark with age and oil. Cranes swung lazily overhead, their steel arms silhouetted against the pale sky. The smell of coal, salt, and machinery drifted toward the transport ship as it eased closer to shore. For the Japanese women on deck, every detail burned itself into memory. They clutched their satchels tightly and stared through the thinning fog at the figures gathering along the docks. Rows of American soldiers stood waiting, uniforms pressed, rifles resting casually against their shoulders. Their posture was steady, watchful, but not cruel. The women drew in sharp breaths. This was their first true sight of America, and it bore no resemblance to the grotesque caricatures that had filled wartime newspapers back home. In those drawings, the enemy had been hunched and animal-like, faces twisted with hatred. Here, standing clearly in the morning light, the Americans were tall, clean, broad-shouldered. Their hair shone in shades the women rarely saw: brown, blonde, even red. Their jaws were sharp, their eyes startlingly clear. They did not look starved. They did not look sick. They looked strong, like men raised in a land of abundance. One young woman whispered to another, her voice trembling as if confessing a crime, "They are handsome." The word felt dangerous on her tongue, as though even acknowledging it betrayed something sacred. Yet the others heard her, and though none replied, the silence carried a quiet agreement. Orders were barked in English. Boots clanged against metal stairways. Ropes tightened. The ship shuddered gently as it pressed against the pier. One by one, the women descended the gangway, heads bowed, eyes darting forward to steal glances at the soldiers lining their path. The Americans towered over them. The average Japanese man in the 1,940 stood barely over 5 feet tall. These guards, nourished on beef, milk, and steady rations, reached 5 to 8, 5 to 9, some even taller. The women felt the difference immediately, not only in height, but in the confidence with which these men stood. It was as if they had stepped into a land where men were giants. The soldiers watched silently, some with curiosity, others with polite detachment. A few whispered to one another, but there was no jeering, no cruelty in their eyes. One young soldier, no older than 20, shifted his weight awkwardly when a Japanese nurse glanced up at him. Their eyes met for a brief instant. Heat rushed to her face, and she looked away at once, startled by her own reaction. How could she notice such a thing here, as a prisoner? Yet the image lingered, the clean-shaven face, the youth untouched by scars, the unsettling normality of him. At the foot of the gangway, the women were guided into rows. Trucks waited nearby, engines rumbling softly, ready to carry them inland. American officers moved among them with clipboards, checking lists, counting quietly. The process was efficient, clinical, yet beneath it ran something unexpected. Restraint. One officer gestured for a woman to adjust her satchel so it would not fall, careful not to touch her. Another spoke slowly, pointing toward the truck she should board, his tone patient, deliberate. These small gestures clashed violently with the stories told in Japan, where captives were said to be spat upon, beaten, treated worse than animals. The women's hearts raced with the strangeness of it. As the trucks jolted forward, the city unfolded before them. Streets stretched wide, lined with warehouses, cranes, and rail lines. The sky hung heavy with soot, yet through it flashed the brightness of neon signs, English letters glowing in colors the women could not read. Cars passed by smoothly, chrome gleaming, engines humming with ease. America looked alive. In Japan, cities had burned. Tokyo was a field of ash. Osaka scorched. Nagoya shattered. Here, buildings still stood tall. Industry pulsed, and the war seemed to have passed without breaking the land itself. The nurse from Saipan thought of her younger brother, who had died of malnutrition 2 years earlier. She remembered his thin wrists, the way hunger had dulled his eyes. Then she looked again at the Americans driving the trucks, broad backs, strong arms, laughter slipping easily between them. Something twisted inside her. Envy, grief, wonder. If the enemy had lived like this, she wondered, had they ever truly known the same war? The convoy rolled onward toward the camps that awaited. Along the roadside, American civilians paused to watch. Children stood barefoot in the dust, waving with curiosity. Some adults watched quietly, arms folded, not welcoming, not hostile, merely cautious. What unsettled the women most was not hatred. It was indifference. They were not spectacles, not trophies, just another consequence of a war already ending. That anonymity was both relief and wound. To be invisible was safer, but it also confirmed how powerless they had become. Inside the truck, whispers spread again. "They look like film stars," murmured the 21-year-old clerk, awe trembling in her voice. An older woman hissed softly, "Do not speak such things." Yet even she could not deny what they all felt. The men around them, clean, tall, steady, were not the monsters of propaganda. In a way that deeply unsettled them, they were admirable. The convoy reached the countryside. Fields stretched wide, green and gold beneath the sun. Farmhouses dotted the land, porches lined with rocking chairs, barns painted bright red. The women stared in silence. This, too, was America, fertile, untouched by firebombs, a land that seemed to grow strength from its soil. The contrast to their own villages, scorched, emptied, was unbearable. Some women felt tears sting their eyes and quickly wiped them away. By the time the trucks slowed at the camp gates, their minds churned with contradiction. They had expected cruelty and found courtesy. They had feared monsters and found men who looked like farmers, athletes, actors. They had imagined a wasteland of arrogance and instead saw abundance untouched by ruin. As the gates opened, the American guards laughed among themselves, tossing a baseball back and forth while waiting for orders. The ball arced high in the afternoon light, caught easily by hands unshaken by war. The women stopped, watching. To them, it was more than a game. It was proof that America had endured the war with its vitality intact, while Japan had crumbled into ashes. The nurse's eyes followed the ball as it sailed again through the air. For the first time, she felt the full weight of the question clawing at all of them. If everything they had believed was false, what truths would this land now force them to face? The gates closed behind them with a heavy metallic clang, a sound that made several women flinch. Yet what lay inside was not the grim barracks they had imagined. The American camp stretched across rolling fields, its wooden huts aligned in neat rows like farm buildings. Fences stood tall, but they did not feel oppressive. Guards walked the perimeter with rifles resting loosely on their shoulders, their expressions bored rather than cruel. The women stepped onto gravel paths that crunched beneath their shoes, hearts pounding with disbelief. They had prepared themselves for darkness, for cages, for brutality. Instead, they were met with order, cleanliness, and the faint, almost unbearable smell of bread baking somewhere nearby. On the first morning, they were awakened not by shouts or blows, but by a bell ringing across the camp like a schoolyard chime. They dressed quickly and lined up, unsure what would come next. Breakfast trays were handed out one by one, Scrambled eggs, thick slices of bread glistening with butter, bacon sizzling on tin plates. Several women simply stared. One nurse whispered to the clerk beside her, her voice shaking. "This would feed a family for a week in Tokyo." The clerk nodded, unable to speak, tears pooling in her eyes. For months, they had survived on thin rice gruel, on weeds boiled in water. Here, in the land of the enemy, food arrived in quantities they had not dared to imagine. Some women wept silently as they ate, ashamed that their first tears in captivity came not from cruelty, but from kindness. Life inside the camp settled into an unexpected rhythm. Each day followed a schedule: meals, roll calls, medical checks, light work details for those willing. The women were issued plain uniforms, neither humiliating nor harsh, simply durable clothing meant for labor. Their barracks were separate from the men's, lined with wooden bunks and thin mattresses. At night, whispers filled the darkness, questions of home, memories spoken in fragments, confessions shared softly so no one else would hear. They spoke of husbands lost in jungles, of brothers who had marched away and never returned, of children they might never see again. Beneath the grief lay the same question, repeated again and again. Why were they being treated with dignity in the land of their conquerors? The Americans themselves seemed uncertain how to behave. Guards approached politely, handing out soap, showing where the showers were, explaining slowly, sometimes with gestures, how unfamiliar things worked. One soldier laughed gently when a woman stared in wonder at hot water pouring endlessly from a tap. "It's just plumbing," he said, unaware of the miracle it represented after years of rationing. Another day, when a woman struggled to lift a crate, a guard stepped forward and took it from her hands with a shy, apologetic smile. The interaction lasted only seconds, but afterward she whispered to the others, astonished, "I thought he would strike me. Instead, he helped." The contradiction gnawed at them daily, forcing them to unlearn truths they had believed unshakable. Not all moments were gentle. They were still prisoners. Their movements were restricted. The fences and rifles were constant reminders of defeat. Yet cruelty did not define the camp. Instead, it was defined by a strange balance of restraint and abundance, as if the Americans had chosen to display victory not through punishment, but through control, feeding the enemy, housing them cleanly, allowing them to work. These acts became quiet demonstrations of power. "We are strong enough to be merciful." One afternoon, the women stood gathered in the yard while American soldiers tossed a baseball back and forth, laughter rising easily into the warm air. The women watched, transfixed by the effortlessness of it. Before the war, their own brothers had played with makeshift balls wrapped from scraps of cloth. Here, the game seemed woven into daily life, untouched by hunger. "It is like watching another world," the clerk whispered. She was right. The camp felt less like a cage and more like a mirror, reflecting how different their worlds had been long before the war ever began. The nurse from Saipan found herself studying the guards' faces when they thought no one was looking. Sunburned skin, freckles, strong jaws, teeth startlingly white compared to the malnourished men she had tended in field hospitals. She thought of her fiancé, sent to sea in 1943 and never returned. He had been thin, his skin sallow, his shoulders narrow from lack of food. The men before her now looked like giants. She hated herself for noticing, yet could not stop. The contrast cut deep, a wound that refused to close. Letters arrived regularly for the Americans, delivered in neat stacks. The women watched soldiers open envelopes, smile, sometimes turn away to wipe tears before slipping photographs into their breast pockets. Family seemed close for them, present even across oceans. For the Japanese women, family existed only as memory, fading and unreachable. That distance hurt more than the fences, and yet small connections formed. When a woman thanked a guard in broken English for extra soap, he tipped his cap exaggeratedly, as if greeting a lady, making her laugh despite herself. It was the first laughter she had released since capture. Another day, when a storm battered the camp, guards and prisoners worked together to secure roofs and shutters, moving with shared urgency against the wind. Captor and captive, briefly united against the weather. The memory lingered. International Red Cross reports would later note the unusual fairness of American prisoner camps, contrasting them sharply with the brutal conditions endured by Allied prisoners across Asia. The women did not read those reports, but they lived their truth: daily soap, clean sheets, warm meals. Kindness itself became disorienting. Some lay awake at night, wondering if it was a trick, if cruelty would come later. Others whispered that perhaps Americans were not what they had been told at all. Days lengthened. Shock softened into uneasy familiarity. They learned the taste of white bread, the warmth of hot showers, the sound of baseballs snapping into leather gloves. Yet beneath this new normal pulsed a constant question. What did it mean that their enemy treated them better than their own army sometimes had? One evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, the nurse stood near the fence, watching guards silhouetted against the fading light. Their laughter drifted across the yard, careless, alive. A pang struck her chest, not only grief, but something harder to name, a realization that the world was far more complicated than the stories she had been fed. She pressed her hand against the rough wooden wall of the barracks as the thought formed, uninvited and unsettling. Perhaps the true captivity was not these fences, but the lies she had carried into them. Winter settled over the camp slowly, softening its edges with frost and muting the clang of gates beneath thin layers of snow. Breath rose in pale clouds as the women wrapped themselves in issued coats and crossed the yard, boots crunching over frozen ground. Guards stamped their feet for warmth, their breath visible too, reminders that cold did not distinguish between victor and defeated. It had been months since the transport ship first revealed the shock of tall American soldiers on the docks. In that time, fear had not vanished, but it had transformed. It sharpened into something more complex: awareness rather than terror. The women were still prisoners, still bound by fences and rules, yet the men around them had begun to appear less like faceless enemies and more like young lives running parallel to their own. The nurse often paused near the kitchen building, watching soldiers unload sacks of flour, crates of apples, barrels of supplies. They joked as they worked, tossing apples between them, laughing as one missed a catch and scrambled in the snow. She thought of her fiancé, lost to the sea, and felt grief press harder against her chest. The vitality of the men before her made that loss heavier, not lighter. She could not decide whether the sight comforted her or wounded her more deeply. Evenings in the barracks grew quieter, though whispers still threaded through the darkness. One woman confessed she dreamed of the guards, not dreams of cruelty, but dreams in which they were simply men, laughing in the yard, playing baseball beneath a clear sky. Another admitted she no longer knew whether to cling to the anger drilled into her or to acknowledge the kindness she had tasted in bread and soap. Shame colored their voices. So did relief. The change came slowly, almost invisibly, yet it altered the very air they breathed. The Americans changed too. Guards who had once maintained stiff distance began to relax, though always within the rules. One young soldier sketched clumsy flowers on scraps of paper and left them near the laundry hut, embarrassed when the women noticed. Another taught a woman a few words of English: good morning, thank you, laughing when she repeated them with exaggerated care. These were not grand gestures of friendship. They were fragments of humanity, small enough to slip through the cracks left by war. Official reports would later describe such camps as models of compliance with the Geneva Convention. In 1945 and 1946, International Red Cross observers noted American adherence to standards of treatment that stood in stark contrast to the disease and brutality recorded in Japanese-run camps across Asia. The women never saw these documents. They did not need to. Each bar of soap, each plate of food, each clean blanket spoke louder than any report. Yet the transformation carried pain alongside relief. Every sign of American strength, well-fed bodies, clean uniforms, laughter that came easily, was also a reminder of Japan's ruin. Their homeland lay in ashes. Families struggled to eat. Brothers and fathers had died gaunt and broken. To watch their captors thrive while their own kin had perished was an agony that could not be explained away by gratitude. The women carried that grief like a second skin. One afternoon, the nurse stood by the fence as a guard sat nearby, writing a letter home. His pencil moved steadily across the paper, lips forming words silently as he wrote. When he paused, staring toward the distant hills, she wondered who waited for him. A wife, a sweetheart, a mother. She thought of the letters she would never write, the faces she would never see again. A bitter truth struck her with unexpected force. This man, her captor, might know more peace and joy in his lifetime than her fiancé ever had. She turned away quickly, but the thought clung to her like frost. Seasons turned. The echoes of war softened into memory. The women began to mark time not by fear, but by small rituals. They swept barracks floors carefully, folded, issued uniforms with precision, cared for one another when illness passed through the camp. Some worked in small gardens under watchful eyes, pressing seeds into soil dark with promise. Touching earth again felt like touching life itself. Routine gave shape to days that might otherwise have blurred into emptiness. And always, above that routine, loomed the tall figures of American soldiers, living proof that the world was not what they had been taught. One afternoon, a soldier carried a small record player into the yard. He cranked it, and music spilled into the air swing rhythms, brassy and alive. The women froze, startled by the sound. A few smiled despite themselves. Some guards clapped in time, joking with one another. The nurse closed her eyes and listened. Tears burned behind her lids. Music, of all things, reminded her that joy still existed even here, even now. It felt almost cruel in its beauty. Yet the moment carved itself into her memory as proof that the walls between enemy and human had cracked wide enough to let something fragile slip through. By spring, whispers of release spread quietly through the camp. The war had been over for months. Repatriation loomed. For many women, the thought of returning to Japan stirred complicated emotions. They longed for home, yet feared what home had become. News filtered in of rubble, hunger, and mourning. To leave the camp meant facing a nation reshaped by defeat. Strangely, for some, the fences no longer felt only like prison. They felt like shelter from a harsher reality waiting beyond. When departure day approached, the women gathered their belongings. Coats were folded, bundles tied. Once more, they lined up for transport. The nurse looked back at the camp one final time. The barracks stood quiet. The fences remained tall. Guards watched as they always had. Yet it was not the fences that stayed sharp in her memory. It was the smell of bacon in the mornings, the warmth of hot showers, polite gestures offered without words, tall soldiers tossing a baseball in the sunlight. As the trucks rolled toward the port, the women whispered among themselves, "Not monsters." One said softly, "Men." Another replied, "They look like film stars." Someone added, this time without shame, "They treated us better than we expected." The nurse said nothing. Her eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead. Inside her, something had shifted, not toward admiration, not toward forgiveness, but toward understanding. A heavy, difficult understanding that truth was more complicated than any story she had been told. At the harbor, gray ships waited to carry them back across the Pacific, toward the ashes of Japan. The women climbed aboard, satchels clutched tightly, hearts divided. Behind them, America receded, a land of contradiction, of victory and restraint, of unexpected mercy. As the engines roared to life, the nurse pressed her hands together and whispered a prayer. Not for victory, not for revenge, but for clarity. She did not know what awaited her in her homeland, but she knew one truth would remain with her forever. The enemy had looked into her eyes and treated her as human, and that memory, painful, luminous, impossible to erase, would endure. Years later, when memory softened the sharpest edges of that journey, the women would struggle to explain what had changed inside them. They would speak of defeat, of hunger, of shame carried home like a second burden. But beneath those words lay something harder to articulate. They had crossed an ocean expecting brutality and found restraint. They had been taught to fear monsters and instead met men ordinary, flawed, sometimes kind. That contradiction did not erase the pain of war, nor did it absolve its cruelty, but it shattered certainty, and certainty, once broken, could never be fully restored. For some, the experience became a quiet secret, spoken of only in fragments. For others, it lingered as a question passed silently from one generation to the next. How could enemies treat us with dignity when our own world had collapsed? What had we been fighting for? If truth itself had been bent into shape by fear? The nurse from Saipan carried that question home with her. Japan greeted her with ruins and ration lines, with faces hollowed by loss. Yet even amid the ashes, she could not forget the camp, the order, the abundance. the strange mercy that had unsettled her more deeply than cruelty ever could. She never spoke of the tall soldiers who tossed baseballs in the sun, nor of the bread that made her cry, nor of the moment she realized that the war had not only destroyed cities, but also the lies that had shaped her youth. History would record the end of the Pacific War in treaties and dates, in signatures and surrender ceremonies. But for those women, the true ending was quieter. It lived in memory, in contradiction, in the painful understanding that humanity had survived even where hatred had been carefully planted. The ocean that once carried them into captivity now lay behind them. Ahead stretched lives forever altered. They returned not with answers, but with a truth that could not be unlearned. War had taught them how easily people could be made enemies. Captivity had taught them something far more unsettling, that enemies too could be human.